pull up a chair, honey, and wrap that blanket a little tighter around your shoulders. You know, they say the most beautiful places can sometimes hide the coldest hearts, and that night in Denver was a testament to that. Outside the Denver Mountain Lodge, the wind was howling like a lonesome wolf, whipping great sheets of crystalline snow against the floor-to-ceiling windows. It was a true Colorado blizzard, the kind that turns the world into a blur of white and makes you feel tiny against the power of the mountains. Inside, you'd think it was the picture of warmth. Massive pine logs were crackling in the great stone fireplace, the scent of expensive bourbon and cedar was thick in the air, and the chandeliers were casting a golden glow over everyone's silk dresses and tailored suits. But let me tell you, as I stood there in the corner with my lukewarm glass of punch, the frost inside that room was far more biting than the storm outside. I looked around at my family, the people who shared my blood but felt like total strangers. They were all huddled together, laughing and clinking glasses, celebrating my brother Parker's engagement to a girl whose smile didn't quite reach her eyes. The laughter was loud, but it felt hollow, like a bell with a crack in it. I remember smoothing down the fabric of my dress, a simple navy blue thing I'd bought on sale, and feeling like a gray smudge on a vibrant painting. My mother was flitting about, gushing to the guests about Parker's meteoric rise in the corporate world, her voice trilling with a pride she never quite found for me. Every time I tried to join a circle of conversation, the air would just go still. You've felt that, haven't you? That subtle shift where the smiles become a little too tight and the eyes start wandering for someone more important to talk to. I was the quiet Cassandra, the one who stayed in her lane, the one they'd all decided years ago was just a filler character in the grand story of the successful family. I watched the snow piling up against the glass, forming a wall between us and the rest of the world, and I realized then that I was just as isolated inside that crowded, glowing lodge as a traveler lost in the drifts. The fire was roaring, dear, but I had never felt a deeper chill in my bones. It wasn't just the mountain air, it was the realization that in a room full of people who were supposed to love me, I was completely and utterly invisible. I didn't have much time to dwell on that lonely feeling, though, because the sharp ring of a silver spoon against a crystal glass sliced right through the chatter. It was my brother, Parker. He stood there on the landing of the grand staircase, looking every bit the prince the family had raised him to be. He had this smirk on his face, the kind that looks like a smile if you don't know any better, and his eyes were bright with a sort of feverish excitement. The room went quiet, but it wasn't a respectful silence, honey. It was that hungry silence you get when people are waiting for a show. Parker raised his glass, the amber liquid catching the firelight, and he began to speak. He started out talking about his engagement, about how his life was a series of triumphs, one after another. He thanked our parents for their unwavering investment in him, and the way he said it made it sound like they'd bet on a winning horse. But then, his gaze shifted. He looked right across that crowded room, past the flower arrangements and the expensive catering, and his eyes locked onto mine. I felt a cold knot tighten in my stomach. I knew that look. It was the look he used to give me when we were children right before he'd break one of my dolls just to see if I'd cry. You know, Parker said, his voice dropping into a tone that was far too intimate for a room of 50 people, we've been very blessed in this family. But we've also had our challenges. We've had to carry those who just couldn't quite find their footing. He didn't say my name yet, but he didn't have to. I could feel the eyes in the room beginning to swivel, one by one, like slow-moving spotlights turning toward me. I wanted to look away, to find a crack in the floorboards to disappear into, but I stayed rooted to the spot. I held my glass so tight I thought the stem might snap. My sister, Cassandra, he continued, and the way he said my name felt like a slur. She's the one we don't talk about much at the office. The family failure, as Dad likes to joke. A few people actually chuckled at that, honey. Can you believe it? A light, polite ripple of laughter at a woman's expense. Parker didn't stop there. He went on a long, rambling monologue about how I'd bounced from one little project to another, how I'd stayed in my quaint small-time consulting while he was out there conquering the world. He painted a picture of me as a charity case, a person who lived on the fringes of their greatness, barely scraping by and constantly needing the family name to open doors that would otherwise be slammed in my face. Inside, I felt like I was being hollowed out. It's one thing to be ignored, but it's another thing entirely to be used as a prop for someone else's ego. Every word he spoke was a lie, or a twisted half-truth, but the silence in that room made them feel like gospel. No one stood up for me. My mother just smoothed her dress and looked at her shoes, and my father nodded along, a proud, stoic mask on his face. The silence wasn't just in the room, it was a silence of the soul. It was the sound of a dozen bridges burning at once. Parker leaned over the railing, looking down at me with a mock-sympathetic pout. "But don't worry, Cassie," he said, using that childhood nickname I hated. "We'll always have a place for you. Someone has to be the cautionary tale, right? Here's to my sister, the girl who taught us all that even if you don't have talent, you can at least have, well, you have a very nice navy dress." He tipped his glass toward me and took a long, slow sip. The silence that followed was heavy, like a wet wool blanket. It was a chilling, suffocating stillness. For a moment, even the wind outside seemed to stop howling, as if the storm itself was embarrassed for me. I could hear the clock on the mantel ticking, 1, 2, 3, each second feeling like a physical blow. I looked at the faces of my cousins, my aunts, my friends, and all I saw was pity or, worse, a cruel sort of boredom. They believed him. Or maybe they just didn't care enough to doubt him. My heart was thumping so hard I could hear it in my ears, a rhythmic drumming that started to drown out the rekindled chatter. In that moment of absolute public humiliation, something shifted inside me. The warmth I'd been trying to cultivate for years, the desire to be loved and accepted by these people, it just extinguished. Like a candle caught in a draft, it went out, leaving behind nothing but cold, hard clarity. I wasn't the failure they thought I was. I was the one who had spent the last decade quietly cleaning up the messes Parker left behind. I was the one who had sacrificed my own savings to keep the family's reputation from crumbling while he was out playing the big shot. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I didn't throw my drink in his face, though Lord knows I wanted to. I just stood there in my nice navy dress, feeling the ice from the windows seep into my spirit. I realized then that they didn't know me at all. They were celebrating a man who was a hollow shell, and they were mocking the woman who had kept that shell from cracking. The silence of the room was a gift, in a way. It was the quiet before a different kind of storm. I looked at Parker, who was now being patted on the back by a group of his friends, and I didn't feel sad anymore. I felt powerful. Because for the first time in 41 years, I didn't care what they thought. I knew the truth, and as I watched the snow pile up against the glass, I knew that the truth was about to come out in a way that would freeze them all right where they stood. Now, Don't you go thinking that my silence at that party was born out of weakness. No, honey, it was born out of a weary, bone-deep knowledge of the truth. To understand why those insults stung so bad, you have to look back just a few weeks before that snowy night in Denver. While Parker was busy picking out the silk thread for his custom suits and bragging about his executive prowess, I was sitting in my home office until 3 in the morning, the only light in the room coming from the blue glow of my computer screen and a single, flickering vanilla candle. You see, Parker had landed what he called the deal of a lifetime with a national shipping conglomerate. He'd strutted around for days like a peacock in a petting zoo, telling everyone who would listen that he'd single-handedly secured the family's legacy. But he'd been so busy dreaming of the commission that he'd been sloppy, dangerous kind of sloppy. He'd sent me the draft just to take a quick peek, as he always did, disguised as a favor to give me something to do. When I opened those files, my heart nearly skipped a beat. It wasn't just a few typos, dear. He had completely miscalculated the fuel surcharge escalators and failed to include a force majeure clause for the very mountain routes he was so proud of. If that contract had been signed as it was, the company wouldn't have made a profit, they would have bled dry within 6 months. He was standing on the edge of a cliff, and the boy was too arrogant to even look down. I remember the smell of that cold coffee sitting on my desk as I went to work. I didn't call him to gloat. I didn't lecture him. I just opened up my spreadsheets and began the invisible work. I spent 4 nights straight recalculating every single line of those logistics tables. My eyes were stinging, and my back was aching, but I moved the numbers around like a master weaver at a loom, tucking away his mistakes and strengthening the weak spots until the deal was actually ironclad. I stayed up until the sun started peeking through the blinds, turning his disaster into a masterpiece, and then I emailed it back to him with a simple note, "Fixed a few clerical errors for you, Parker. Good luck." He never even thanked me. He probably didn't even read my changes closely enough to realize I'd saved his career. He just took my work, slapped his name on it, and marched into that boardroom to take the credit. But the contract wasn't the worst of it. Oh no, it never is with family, is it? About 10 days before the engagement party, I got a frantic, muffled phone call from him in the middle of the afternoon. He wasn't the golden boy then, he sounded like a scared little kid. He'd managed to overextend a personal line of credit to pay for that flashy engagement ring and the deposit on the lodge, and a minor accounting oversight, his words, not mine, had left a $14,000 hole in the office escrow account he was supposed to be managing. It was embezzlement, plain and simple, even if he called it a temporary float. He was sobbing, honey. Real, messy tears. He told me he'd be ruined, that Mom and Dad would never recover from the shame, and that he'd lose everything. And like a fool, like the big sister I've always been, I felt that old tug at my heartstrings. I looked at my own savings account, the one I'd built dollar by dollar from my consulting work, the money I'd set aside for a down payment on a little cottage by the lake where I could finally find some peace. I remember my hand trembling just a little bit as I picked up my phone to authorize the wire transfer. $14,000. It was a staggering amount for me, but for Parker, it was just the price of keeping his mask from slipping. I didn't ask for a promissory note. I didn't demand interest. I just clicked send and watched the balance of my life's work drop in an instant. I saved his reputation, I saved his job, and I saved that precious family name he loved to throw around. I did all that in the dark, in the quiet, in the shadows where I've lived my whole life. I was the bridge he walked over to get to his success, and he didn't even look down to see who was holding him up. So, when he stood on those stairs at the lodge, looking down his nose at my navy dress and calling me a failure in front of everyone we knew, I wasn't just hurt. I was seeing the sheer, breathtaking scale of his delusion. I sat there with the ghost of that $14,000 transfer in my mind and the memory of those late-night spreadsheets burned into my eyes. I realized that Parker didn't just think I was a failure, he needed me to be one. Because if I was a success, then he had to admit he was a fraud. He was eating the fruit from the tree I'd watered with my own sweat and then mocking me for having dirt under my fingernails. The room was filled with the sound of people cheering for him, celebrating the brilliant businessman who couldn't even balance a ledger without his sister's help. I looked at my parents, who were beaming with such unearned pride, and I realized that my kindness had become a cage. By saving him, I'd allowed them to keep believing the lie. But as I sat there, the shadow fixer finally decided she was done working in the dark. If they wanted to see what a failure looked like, I was more than happy to stop holding up the walls and let the whole house come crashing down on their heads. The sun rose the next morning with a cruel, blinding brightness, the kind that only happens after a blizzard when the world is draped in a fresh, thick blanket of white. I sat in my small kitchen, my hands wrapped around a heavy ceramic mug of tea, watching the steam curl into the cold morning air. My house was quiet, blessedly, perfectly quiet, but my mind was a roar of echoes from the night before. 41 years. That's a long time to walk this earth, honey, and it's an even longer time to spend trying to fit into a mold that was never shaped for you. I looked around my kitchen. It wasn't the marble and chrome showroom Parker lived in, but every tile, every curtain, and every well-seasoned cast-iron skillet had been earned with my own grit. At 41, most women are told they should have it all figured out, but as I sat there, I felt like I was looking at the ledger of my life and seeing nothing but red ink in the family column. For 4 decades, I played the role they assigned me. I was the dependable one, the plain one, the one who didn't need the spotlight because I was supposedly content in the shadows. But what they never cared to see was the unseen life I'd built outside their narrow vision. They saw a woman who did little consulting projects from home, but the truth was far more complex. While they were at country clubs and galas, I was the one major firms called when their foundations were rotting. I was the fixer of broken companies. I had a knack for seeing the ghost in the machine, the tiny accounting error or the cultural rift that could sink a billion-dollar ship. I turned around 3 failing logistics firms in the last 5 years alone, earning a reputation in the industry as the woman who could find a needle in a haystack and use it to sew the whole company back together. I was successful, I was wealthy in my own right, and I was damn good at what I did. Yet, when I stepped across the threshold of my parents' house, all of that prestige evaporated. To them, I was still the girl who didn't get into the right sorority, the woman who didn't marry a man with a title, the disappointment who didn't make the family look like a shiny brochure. It's a heavy thing, dear, to carry the weight of being a failure when you know, deep in your marrow, that you're the most capable person in the room. It's like wearing a lead coat that everyone else thinks is made of silk. I took a sip of my tea, feeling the warmth spread through my chest, and I thought about the $14,000 I'd wired to Parker. That money was supposed to be my peace fund. It was the final bit I needed to buy that little cabin I'd been eyeing, the place where the only voices I'd hear would be the wind and the birds. I'd given it up to save a brother who, just hours later, stood on a staircase and used me as a punchline. I'd been a bridge for people who wouldn't even step over a puddle to help me. You know, there's a certain kind of exhaustion that sleep can't fix. It's the tiredness of being the only person who knows the truth in a family built on lies. I looked at an old photograph on my sideboard, a picture of Parker and me when we were children. He was holding a trophy he'd won at a science fair, though I remembered vividly that I'd done all the wiring for the volcano model while he watched television. Even then, the pattern was set. He got the gold, I got the grease on my fingers. For 41 years, I had been the safety net. When my parents' investments faltered, I'd quietly moved funds through their accountant to keep them afloat without them ever knowing. When my cousin Mark's business was failing, I'd written a white paper under a pseudonym that saved his livelihood. I was the invisible hand that kept the American Granny Stories family from becoming a tragedy. And for what? So I could be mocked in front of a room full of strangers? The silence in my kitchen started to feel different then. It wasn't the lonely silence of the night before. It was becoming a sharp, focused silence. I realized that my family didn't actually hate me, they just didn't respect me because I'd never forced them to. I'd played the good girl for so long that they'd forgotten I was a grown woman with the power to ruin them all with a single phone call. I thought about Parker's face when he laughed at my dress. He thought he was untouchable. He thought the family failure would just go back to her little house, cry into her tea, and wait for the next time he needed a bailout. But as the sun climbed higher over the snow-capped Rockies, I felt a strange, cold peace settle over me. The unseen success I'd built was about to become very, very visible. I wasn't just a daughter or a sister anymore. I was a professional who had been disrespected for the last time. I set my mug down on the table with a firm, decisive clack. I didn't need their validation, and I certainly didn't need their love if it came at the price of my dignity. I'd spent my life fixing things for people who broke them on purpose. Well, honey, I think it's about time I let something stay broken. I walked over to my laptop and opened my email. There was an invitation sitting in my inbox from Theodore Ramsay, a man who actually knew what I was worth. It was time to stop being the family's disappointment and start being their reckoning. I had the skills, I had the evidence, and for the first time in my life, I had the will to use them. The morning after the storm is always the clearest, and for me, the view was finally starting to look like just. To really understand the poison in that room at the lodge, you have to look back at the soil where we were planted. You see, honey, in our house, there was a roadmap laid out before we could even walk, but it only had one name written in gold ink, Parker. From the time he was a toddler with golden curls and a toothy grin, my parents looked at him like he was a miracle they'd personally engineered. He was the golden child, the one meant for greatness, while I was just the support beams in the house they were building for him. I remember when we were kids, maybe 10 and 12. Parker decided he wanted to be a star athlete. My father spent every weekend out in the yard, coaching him, shouting encouragement that echoed through the neighborhood, buying the most expensive cleats and the latest gear. Parker wasn't actually very fast, and he had a habit of dropping the ball when the pressure got high, but you'd never know it from the way Dad talked at Sunday dinner. To hear them tell it, Parker was the second coming of a Hall of Famer. Me? I was obsessed with how things worked. I'd take apart old radios to see the circuitry, or I'd spend my afternoons at the library reading about how the Great Depression changed the way banks were built. When I tried to show my father a complex logic puzzle I'd solved or a business model I'd mapped out for a lemonade stand that actually accounted for overhead and supply chains, he'd just pat my head with a distracted smile. "That's nice, Cassie," he'd say, his eyes already drifting back to Parker's trophy shelf. "Why don't you go help your mother in the kitchen? That's a bit unconventional for a girl, don't you think?" It wasn't that they were mean, at least not at first. It was just that my achievements were boring. When I made the dean's list in college while working 2 jobs, it was met with a "that's what's expected, dear." But when Parker managed to scrape a C- in a business class he barely attended, they threw him a celebratory barbecue. They groomed him for a throne he hadn't earned, teaching him that his charm was more valuable than competence, and that the family would always be there to catch him if he tripped. I remember one summer during university. I had landed a prestigious internship at a high-level forensic accounting firm. It was a big deal, honey, thousands of applicants, and they chose me. I came home bursting with the news, practically vibrating with pride. I walked into the living room, and before I could get a word out, Mom announced that they'd decided to buy Parker a brand new convertible because he'd finally found himself and decided to join the family's real estate firm. My news stayed in my throat. I sat there and listened to them discuss the upholstery of his new car for 2 hours. My internship was never mentioned again. To them, my hard work was just Cassie being studious, a quiet background noise to the grand symphony of Parker's existence. That's how the rivalry grew, though it wasn't a fair fight. It was a war where one side didn't even know the other was suffering. Parker grew up believing the world owed him a standing ovation just for showing up. He learned that if he made a mistake, he could just flash that golden boy smile and someone, usually me, would fix it. And I learned to hide my light. I learned that if I wanted validation, I had to find it in the work itself, because it was never coming from the dinner table. I watched as they poured every resource into him. They paid for his elite MBA, even though he spent more time at the golf course than in the library. They used their connections to land him that executive VP role, a position he was about as qualified for as a house cat is for flying a jet. And all the while, I was building my own path, brick by heavy brick, in the unconventional world of corporate restructuring. They thought I was just a quiet consultant because I didn't have a corner office with my name on the door. They didn't realize that the boring work I was doing was actually the art of keeping empires from falling. They saw my lack of flash as a lack of ambition. They misinterpreted my silence for a lack of soul. But you see, honey, when you groom a child for success without teaching them the value of the climb, you're not building a leader, you're building a facade. Parker was a beautiful house with no foundation, and I was the structural engineer who knew exactly where the cracks were because I'd been the one filling them with my own mortar for years. The rivalry wasn't about who had more money or who was smarter. It was about the fact that Parker was a character created by my parents' vanity, and I was a woman forged in the fire of their neglect. He was the golden child who could do no wrong, and I was the family failure who did everything right but had the audacity to be boring while doing it. As I sat in my quiet kitchen that morning after the party, reflecting on all those years of being passed over and pushed aside, I realized the grooming was finally over. The golden boy was about to find out what happens when his support beams finally decide to walk away and let the roof cave in. I hadn't even finished my second cup of tea when a low, heavy hum vibrated through the floorboards of my little home office. It wasn't the familiar rattle of the mail truck or the high-pitched whine of a neighbor's leaf blower. This was the sound of a serious engine, the kind that costs more than some people's houses. I set my mug down and peeked through the lace curtains, and my heart gave a funny little skip. Sitting at the curb was a sleek, midnight black sedan, polished so bright it looked like a mirror reflecting the mountain snow. A moment later, a man stepped out. He was tall, dressed in a charcoal overcoat that looked like it had been stitched by angels, and he moved with the kind of measured purpose that makes everyone else in the vicinity feel like they're moving in slow motion. It was Theodore Ramsay. The Theodore Ramsay. The man whose name was whispered in boardroom hallways like a prayer or a warning, depending on which side of the ledger you sat on. He was the CEO of the very logistics giant where Parker played at being a big shot, and he was arguably one of the most powerful men in the tri-state area. My first thought, the one that came from that old, wounded part of me, was that Parker had finally done it. He'd finally messed up so bad that the big boss himself had come to hand-deliver my brother's termination papers to his next of kin. Or worse, maybe Parker had told them I was the one who handled the clerical errors and they were here to sue me for interfering. My hands felt cold as I smoothed my hair and walked to the door. When I opened it, the crisp air rushed in, but Theodore's presence felt even more chilling. "Cassandra Miller?" he asked. His voice was like fine gravel, rough but expensive. He didn't wait for a formal invitation, he just gave a polite nod that somehow signaled he was coming inside whether I was ready or not. I led him back to my office, the modest little room my parents loved to poke fun at. It was small, yes, filled with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves and a desk that had seen more late nights than a Las Vegas dealer. As he sat in the guest chair, a sturdy oak thing that suddenly looked very small beneath him, he didn't say a word. He just looked. He looked at my filing system, he looked at the framed certificates I never showed the family, and he looked at the open ledger on my desk. The silence stretched out, long and thin, like a wire being pulled until it's ready to snap. I sat behind my desk, trying to keep my breathing steady. "Mr. Ramsay," I said, my voice steadier than I felt, "I assume you're here about my brother, Parker. If there's a discrepancy in the latest filing, I can assure you." He held up a hand, a single diamond on his pinky ring catching the light. "I'm not here about Parker, Cassandra. To be quite honest, I have people for the Parkers of the world. They're a dime a dozen, loud, shiny, and ultimately hollow." He leaned forward, his eyes locking onto mine with a sharp, predatory intelligence. "No, I'm here because I spent the last 3 hours reviewing the metadata on the Sterling account restructuring. The work Parker claimed as his own." My stomach dropped. So he knew. He knew I'd been in the files. I opened my mouth to apologize, to offer to pay back the $14,000, to beg him not to ruin the family name, but he spoke over me, his voice softening just a fraction. "I've seen that handwriting before, Cassandra. Not the literal script, but the logic. The way the contingencies are layered. The way the risk is mitigated before the client even knows it exists. It's elegant. It's surgical. And it's a style I haven't seen in 15 years. I felt a prickle at the back of my neck. 15 years. That was a lifetime ago. Back when I was a hungry 26-year-old trying to make a name for myself, before I'd learned that my family preferred me invisible. "You look confused," Theodore said, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. "Perhaps you don't remember a small, struggling tech startup called Arcus Systems? back when it was just 3 guys in a basement and a debt load that should have buried them? The memory hit me like a physical blow. Arcus. My first real shadow job. I'd done it for a friend of a friend, a man who was losing sleep in his hair trying to keep his dream alive. I'd spent 6 weeks mapping out a recovery plan for them, working for nothing but coffee and the thrill of the puzzle. I'd never even met the owner in person. I'd sent all my reports through an intermediary and then disappeared into the night once the black ink started flowing again. I remember, I whispered. Theodore nodded. I was the owner of Arcus, Cassandra. Your work didn't just save my company, it gave me the foundation to build the empire I sit on today. I spent years trying to track down the ghost of Arcus, but you'd covered your tracks too well. Until yesterday. Until I saw those same clerical errors fixed in Parker's files with that same unmistakable, brilliant logic. He stood up then, walking over to my window and looking out at the snow. The tension in the room hadn't vanished, it had just changed shape. It was no longer the tension of a hunted animal, it was the electricity of a lightning strike about to hit. Your brother is a fool, Theodore said, not turning around. He thinks he's been using you. He thinks he's the one in charge. But he's just a paperweight holding down the work of a genius. He sat at my table last night and laughed about your navy dress and your little projects. He has no idea that he's been insulting the woman I've been looking for since 2011. He turned back to me, his expression grave. I didn't come here to talk about Parker's mistakes, Cassandra. I came here because I'm about to undergo the largest corporate acquisition in the history of this state, and my current board is full of Parkers. I need a wolf. I need a fixer. And I think you've spent quite enough time in the shadows, don't you? I looked at him, and for the first time in 41 years, the weight of the family failure label didn't just feel light, it felt gone. It had burned up in the heat of his gaze. I looked at my desk, at the modest room my parents mocked, and I realized that the unexpected visitor wasn't just a boss. He was a mirror. And for the first time, I liked what I saw reflecting back at me. Theodore sat back down, but he didn't lean back. He perched on the edge of that oak chair like a man about to recount a miracle he'd seen with his own 2 eyes. He looked at me, really looked at me, and I saw a flicker of something in his expression that I hadn't seen from a man in a long, long time, genuine, unadulterated respect. Cassandra, he began, his voice dropping to a low, melodic hum, you probably think of Arcus systems as just another puzzle you solved during a rainy spring in your 20s. But for me, it was the world. I was 30 years old, I had a newborn daughter at home, and I had poured every cent of my inheritance and my pride into a dream that was leaking water like a colander. I had 3 weeks of payroll left. 3 weeks before the bank took the house and my dignity with it. He paused, a far-off look entering his eyes, as if he could still see the dusty basement and the stacks of past due notices. I had hired the big firms, the ones with the glossy brochures and the $1,000 an hour consultants. They all told me the same thing, cut your losses, Mr. Ramsay. File for Chapter 7. You were done. They looked at my spreadsheets and saw a funeral. But then, a mutual friend, someone who knew you from your university days, said he knew a girl. Just a girl, he called you. A 26-year-old with a mind like a diamond and a heart that hadn't been hardened by the corporate meat grinder yet. I remembered it then, honey. I remembered the man who had brought me those files. He told me it was a charity case, a favor for a friend who was a good man facing a bad end. I had taken those folders to my kitchen table, the same table where I used to do Parker's homework, and I stayed there for 48 hours straight. I didn't do it for the money, I did it because the numbers were crying out to be fixed. It was like a symphony played out of tune, and I just couldn't stand the dissonance. You sent back a courier 3 days later, Theodore continued, a soft chuckle escaping his throat. No bill. No contract. Just a 100-page binder with a handwritten note on the front that said, "The leak isn't in your sales, it's in your logistics flow. Plug the hole here, and you'll be in the black by July." I remember my lead accountant laughed when he saw it. He said, "What does a kid know that we don't?" But I was desperate. I followed your map to the letter. I restructured the delivery routes, I renegotiated the vendor terms exactly how you scripted them, and I cut the dead weight you'd highlighted in red. He leaned forward, his hands clasped tightly between his knees. By July, we weren't just in the black. We were profitable enough to acquire our largest competitor. That little map you drew for free became the blueprint for everything I own today. I tried to find you, Cassandra. Lord knows I tried. But our mutual friend had moved to Europe, and you, well, you seemed to have vanished into thin air. I didn't realize back then that you hadn't vanished. You'd just been tucked away into a family that was too small-minded to realize they had a titan in their midst. I felt a lump forming in my throat. All those years, I thought of that work as just practice, a hobby I did before I became the family failure. I never knew it had actually meant something to someone. I never knew that while I was being shushed at the dinner table, the empire Theodore Ramsay was building was resting on a foundation I had laid with my own 2 hands. I spent 15 years wondering who the ghost of Arcus was, he said, his voice regaining that steel trap authority. And then last night, I'm sitting at a dinner party for a man I only hired because his father is an old friend, and I hear him laughing. I hear Parker Miller mocking his sister for her hobby. And then he shows me a report he's incredibly proud of, and I see it. The same logic. The same elegant, surgical precision in the data. The same way of turning a disaster into a victory. I realized in that moment that the man I'd hired was a thief, and the woman I'd been looking for was sitting in the corner, being ignored by everyone in the room. Theodore stood up again, and this time, the room seemed to grow even smaller. I owe you more than a thank you, Cassandra. I owe you a 15-year debt of gratitude, with interest. You saved my life when you were 26, and you did it for nothing because you love the work. Well, I'm not that desperate man in the basement anymore. I'm the man who can give you the stage you've earned. He walked over to my desk and tapped the ledger I'd been working on. Parker told me you were a clerical assistant. He told me you were lucky to have the work he gave you. He lied to me, and he betrayed the only person who was keeping him from a prison cell. He thinks he's the king of the mountain, but he doesn't realize the mountain belongs to me, and I'm about to hand the keys to the person who actually knows how to run it. I looked at my hands that had worked in the shadows for so long they'd almost forgotten they were allowed to hold the light. Theodore's words weren't just a revelation, they were a rescue. He wasn't just telling me a story from the past, he was giving me a future that didn't involve hiding. 15 years ago, you were my secret weapon, he said, reaching into his pocket and pulling out a simple, elegant business card. But today? Today, you're the most dangerous woman in Denver. Because you know where all the bodies are buried, you know how to fix the damage, and most importantly, you have no reason left to be loyal to people who would sell your soul for a laugh. The debt is called Cassandra. Are you ready to collect? I looked at that card, then I looked out at the white, silent world beyond my window. The snow was beautiful, but it was cold. And for the first time in 41 years, I realized I didn't have to stay out in the cold anymore. I reached out and took the card. The family failure was officially retired. The ghost of Arcus was back, and this time, she wasn't going to vanish until the job was done. Theodore didn't just hand me that card and walk away, honey. No, he stayed a while longer, leaning against the doorframe of my little office as if he had all the time in the world. He looked out at the snow for a moment, then turned back to me with a look of pure, concentrated bewilderment. He told me that as he sat there at that engagement party, watching the lights sparkle and hearing the ice clink in the glasses, he felt like he'd stepped into an alternate reality, one where the world had been turned upside down and the brightest stars were being treated like dull pebbles. It was the strangest thing I've ever witnessed, Cassandra, he said, shaking his head slowly. I've been in boardrooms from London to Tokyo. I've dealt with egoists, geniuses, and frauds of every stripe. But I have never seen a group of people so collectively blind. I sat there listening to your father brag about Parker's instincts, while I was looking at the man and seeing someone who couldn't find his own shoes without a map. And then, there was you. He stepped closer, his voice dropping into that warm, confidential tone that makes you feel like you're the only person in the world. I looked at you standing there in that corner. You were so quiet, so composed. You had this look in your eyes, the look of a person who sees everything but says nothing. And when Parker started his little failure speech, I expected you to crumble. I expected to see the shame they were trying so hard to heap on you. But you didn't. You just stood there with a dignity that made his shouting feel small and pathetic. It was in that moment, seeing the contrast between the failure they described and the savior I remembered, that the puzzle pieces finally clicked. He chuckled then, a dry, dusty sound. They called you a disappointment because you didn't play their game. They called you unconventional because you weren't interested in the shallow vanity of their circle. But while they were busy polishing their trophies, I was remembering a 26-year-old girl who took a dying company and breathed life into it with nothing but a pen and a sheer, relentless intellect. I was comparing the Parker I saw, a man who spent $40,000 of company money on a ring he couldn't afford, to the Cassandra who saved my life for a thank you and a cup of lukewarm coffee. Theodore sighed, and for a second, he looked almost sorry for my family. It's a dangerous thing to underestimate a person who has nothing to prove to you, Cassandra. Your family spent 40 years trying to convince you that you were small so they could feel big. They created a narrative where Parker was the hero and you were the cautionary tale. But a narrative is just a story, and stories can be rewritten by anyone with a loud enough voice. To them, you were a failure because you didn't bring them status. To me, you were a savior because you brought results. The mismatch between those two identities was so loud, it was practically screaming in my ears all through dinner. He told me how he'd watched my mother's face while Parker was talking. He saw the way she beamed at the lies, nodding along like she was hearing a bedtime story she'd memorized. He saw how my father looked at me with a sort of distant pity, as if I were a broken tool he'd forgotten to throw out. Theodore said it was the most perfect example of a shared delusion he'd ever seen. He realized that they didn't want the truth. They wanted the comfort of their hierarchy, with the golden boy at the top and the unseen daughter at the bottom. The irony, Cassandra, Theodore said, his eyes sharpening again, is that they've spent so much time convincing themselves you're worthless that they've become entirely dependent on you. They don't even realize that the ground they're standing on is only solid because you're the one who paved it. They've mistaken your silence for absence, and your humility for a lack of ambition. But I know better. I know that the failure at that party is the only reason the success at the podium has a job tomorrow morning. I sat there, honey, feeling the weight of his words settle into my soul. It's one thing to know your own worth in the quiet of your heart, but to have a man like Theodore Ramsay lay it out like a legal brief, comparing the lie to the reality, it changed something in me. I felt the last of that heavy, leaden coat of family disappointment just slide off my shoulders and hit the floor. He told me that the world is full of people who talk a big game, people like Parker who are all flash and no substance. But the people who actually move the world, the ones who fix the engines and balance the scales, they're often the ones the world tries to ignore. They tried to bury you, Cassandra, he whispered, but they forgot you were a seed. And I'm here to tell you that the season for staying underground is over. He looked at me with such a piercing clarity that I felt seen for the first time since I was a little girl. He wasn't just comparing two people, he was comparing two ways of living. One was built on the shaky sand of what other people think, and the other was built on the bedrock of what you can actually do. My family chose the sand. Theodore was choosing the rock. As he turned to finally leave, he paused at the door and looked back one last time. Don't let them define the terms of the engagement anymore, Cassandra. They've had 40 years to get to know you, and they failed the test. Now, let's see how they handle it when the failure they've been mocking turns out to be the one holding the mortgage on their entire lives. I watched his car pull away, the black paint cutting through the white snow like a blade. I looked back at my office, at my notebooks and my files, and I realized Theodore was right. The comparison was over. The mismatch was resolved. I wasn't the daughter they imagined, and I wasn't the sister they mocked. I was the woman who had already won the war before they even knew it had started. Theodore didn't just leave me with a few kind words and a memory, honey. He turned back from that door, his hand resting on the frame, and the air in the room suddenly felt electric, like the sky right before a summer cloudburst. He looked at me with a steady, piercing gaze that said he was done with the past and ready to build a very different kind of future. He reached into his leather portfolio and pulled out a thick, cream-colored document. It wasn't just a piece of paper. It was the kind of heavy bond that feels like it has its own gravity. Cassandra, he said, his voice dropping into that deep, serious register he used for closing the deals that made the evening news. I'm not just here for a trip down memory lane. I'm here because I'm in the middle of acquiring the largest logistics network on the Western Seaboard. It's a mess of tangled assets, inflated valuations, and middle managers who wouldn't know a deficit if it bit them on the nose. I've had my top 3 firms look at it, and they've all given me the same safe, timid advice. They're afraid of the risk. They don't have the stomach for the kind of surgical restructuring this requires. He walked back to my desk and laid the document down right over my old, worn ledger. I want you to head the entire project. I'm offering you a primary restructuring contract for the first phase. It's a 6-month commitment, and the retainer is $250,000, with a performance bonus based on the overhead you shave off. The room went so quiet I could hear the tiny ticking of the clock on my mantel. $250,000. Honey, for a woman who had spent her life scraping by on little consulting projects and wiring her last cent to save her brother's neck, that number sounded like a different language. It wasn't just the money, though Lord knows the money was a miracle. It was the weight of it. It was the undeniable proof that I wasn't the failure my mother whispered about at bridge club. I looked down at that document, my vision blurring just a little bit. Theodore noticed. He didn't look away or make a joke to break the tension, he just stood there, giving me the space to let it sink in. "This isn't a favor, Cassandra," he said, and he made sure his voice was as firm as bedrock. "In fact, if I were being honest, I'm probably underpaying you. Most firms would charge me double for half the results you'll deliver. I'm not giving you this because of Arcus, or because I feel sorry for how your family treats you. I'm giving you this because you are the only person I trust to find the truth in these numbers. I need your eyes. I need your boring logic. I need the woman who can see the ghost in the machine." I touched the edge of the paper, feeling the embossed seal of his company. For 41 years, I had been waiting for someone to say those words. Not "you're pretty," or "you're a good daughter," or "you're so helpful," but "you are the best person for the job." It was a validation that hit me right in the center of my chest, knocking the wind out of all those old insults Parker had thrown at me. "Parker is currently in that department," Theodore added, his eyes narrowing slightly. "He'll be reporting to the executive team, which means, effectively, he'll be answering to the data you provide. He doesn't know yet. No one knows. I wanted you to sign before the announcement goes out. I want to see their faces when they realize the woman they laughed at is the one who holds their departmental budgets in her hands." I thought about my parents' faces. I thought about the way they'd look when they found out their unconventional daughter was earning more in 6 months than Parker had in 3 years of failing upward. I thought about that $14,000 I'd wired into the void, and for the first time, I didn't regret it. It was the last payment I'd ever make to the family debt. From here on out, the ledger was balanced. "You don't have to answer right this second," Theodore said, though he knew as well as I did what my answer was going to be. "But if you sign that, your life changes. You won't be the shadow fixer anymore. You'll be the lead architect of a multi-billion-dollar merger. You'll be the one in the room where the real decisions are made. And your family? They'll finally have to look at you, Cassandra. Truly look at you." I looked at the pen sitting in my ceramic holder, a simple, cheap ballpoint I'd used to save my brother's career just weeks ago. I picked it up. My hand wasn't shaking anymore. The chill from the morning was gone, replaced by a slow-burning heat in my veins. "Where do I sign, Theodore?" I asked. He pointed to the last page, a small smile playing on his lips. As the ink hit the paper, I felt something in the house shift. It was as if the walls themselves were exhaling. I wasn't just a daughter, a sister, or a disappointment. I was a professional with a $250,000 mandate and the backing of the most powerful man in the city. Theodore took the signed document and tucked it away. "Welcome to the team, Cassandra. We start on Monday." And don't worry about the dress, you can wear whatever color you like, but I have a feeling that navy blue is going to start looking like a uniform of victory very soon." After he left, I sat in my office for a long time, just listening to the silence. It was the same room as before, the same books, the same view of the Colorado mountains. But everything was different. The validation didn't come from a trophy or a speech at a party. It came from the quiet click of a pen and the knowledge that I had finally stepped out of the shadow and into the light. I was 41 years old, honey, and my life was just beginning. Monday morning came around with a crispness that made my lungs feel brand new. I walked through the glass doors of Ramsay Logistics not as a guest or a clerical helper, but as the lead auditor with a keycard that opened every door in the building. It was a world of steel, glass, and hushed conversations, a far cry from my cozy office at home, but the moment I stepped onto that floor, I felt like I'd finally come home. I wasn't just some woman in a navy dress anymore. I was the person holding the flashlight in a very dark room. Theodore had given me an office on the executive floor, tucked away just enough to keep me out of the line of fire but close enough to hear the heartbeat of the company. My first task was simple on the surface but surgical in nature. I had to peel back the layers of the Western Seaboard acquisition. And that meant diving headfirst into the department managed by none other than my brother, Parker. Now, honey, I've spent 20 years looking at balance sheets, and I can tell you that numbers have a way of whispering the truth even when people are shouting lies. For the first few hours, I just sat there, letting the data wash over me. I looked at the procurement logs, the shipping manifests, and the vendor contracts Parker had been so proud of. At first glance, everything looked shiny. The margins seemed healthy, the growth charts were pointing toward the ceiling, and the reports were filled with the kind of corporate buzzwords that make investors feel warm and fuzzy. But as the afternoon sun began to slant across my desk, I started to see them. The cracks. Tiny at first, a misplaced decimal point in a fuel hedge here, a strangely high consulting fee paid to a shell company there. But as I dug deeper, the cracks turned into canyons. Parker hadn't been managing a department, he'd been running a sophisticated shell game. I remember leaning back in my chair, my heart doing a slow, heavy thud against my ribs. I'd known Parker was sloppy, but this was something else. He'd been inflating the efficiency of his delivery routes by ignoring the maintenance costs of the fleet. He was recording revenue from future contracts as if the cash was already in the bank, a classic trick that works right up until the day the bills come due. And the meteoric rise my parents had bragged about? It was all built on a foundation of borrowed time and creative accounting. I pulled up the file on the Sterling account, the very one I'd stayed up all night to fix for him just weeks before. I saw my own corrections, my own logic, sitting there like a diamond in a coal mine. But then I looked at what had happened after I'd sent him the file. Parker had taken my ironclad contract and used it as collateral to secure a private loan for himself, likely to pay back that $14,000 hole he'd made in the escrow account. He hadn't just used my work to look good, he'd used it to double down on his own corruption. The deeper I went, the more I realized that Parker's entire professional identity was a house of cards sitting in front of a high-powered fan. He was spending money the company didn't have to maintain an image of success that didn't exist. He'd hired his friends into high-paying positions they weren't qualified for, and they were all fixing the books to keep the party going. It was a culture of entitlement that mirrored our childhood home, everyone protecting the golden boy while the foundation crumbled beneath their feet. I remember thinking about that engagement party again. I thought about him standing on those stairs, laughing at me for being a failure. And I felt a wave of cold, hard pity. He really believed his own lies. He'd been told he was a genius for so long that he'd forgotten you actually have to do the work to be one. He was out there in the hallway right now, probably flirting with the receptionists and talking about his next promotion, completely unaware that his clumsy sister was currently holding the detonator to his entire world. By 5 o'clock, I had a folder 3 inches thick. It wasn't just a list of errors, it was a roadmap of a disaster. If Theodore moved forward with the acquisition based on Parker's numbers, the entire company would be facing a federal audit within a year. Parker hadn't just been incompetent, he'd been reckless with thousands of people's livelihoods just so he could keep buying custom suits and looking down his nose at me. I walked over to the window and looked out at the city lights. For 40 years, I'd been the one fixing his messes, quietly mending the fences so nobody would see the rot. I could do it again. I could spend the next month cleaning this up, burying the evidence, and making Parker look like a hero once more. I could stay the shadow fixer and keep the family peace. But then I thought about that $14,000. I thought about the way my father looked through me like I was made of glass. And I realized that the greatest kindness I could show Parker now wasn't to save him, it was to let him face the reality he'd created. My work wasn't about revenge, though it sure felt like a bit of justice was in the air. It was about the truth. And the truth was that Parker Miller was a fraud built on sand. I closed the folder and locked it in my drawer. Tomorrow, I'd have to start interviewing the department heads. Tomorrow, I'd have to look my brother in the eye while I dismantled his fantasy piece by piece. The internal audit had begun, honey, and for the first time in my life, I wasn't going to be the one to catch him when he fell. I was just going to be the one recording the impact. The news of my new position must have hit the office like a lightning strike, because it didn't take long for the predator to start acting like the prey. I was sitting in a little corner booth at the Gilded Bean, a quiet spot 3 blocks away from the office where I thought I could go through the vendor logs in peace. But the bell over the door didn't just jingle, it practically rattled on its hinges. I didn't even have to look up to know who it was. The frantic, heavy footfalls and the scent of expensive, musk-heavy cologne told me everything I needed to know. Parker slid into the booth opposite me without asking, his face a mottled shade of gray and red. Gone was the swaggering prince of the mountain lodge. His tie was loosened, his hair was a mess from running his fingers through it, and his eyes, the eyes that had looked at me with such mockery just days ago, were darting around like trapped birds. He reached out to grab my wrist, but I pulled it back and set my pen down with a quiet, deliberate click. "Cassandra," he hissed, his voice cracking like dry kindling. "What are you doing?" "I just saw the internal memo." "Audit lead? You? Since when do you work for Ramsay directly? And why the hell are you digging through the 2024 logistics manifests? Those files are closed. They're sealed, Cassie." I looked at him, really looked at him, and I didn't feel that old urge to comfort him. I felt like I was looking at a stranger. "Theodore Ramsay hired me, Parker. He hired me to find the truth because he knows I'm the only one who can. And the truth doesn't care about whether a file is sealed or not." He leaned over the table, his voice dropping to a desperate, jagged whisper. "You have to stop. You don't understand how things work at that level. We had to move some numbers around to make the merger look viable. It's what everyone does. It's just corporate theater, Cassie. If you go in there and start pointing out every little discrepancy, you're going to blow the whole thing. You're going to ruin me. You're going to ruin Dad's retirement fund, too. He's got half his portfolio tied up in the merger stock. Ah, there it was. The classic Parker move. When he's in trouble, he hides behind someone else's well-being. He was using our father as a human shield, hoping my guilt would do what his charm couldn't. I saw the escrow hole, Parker, I said, my voice as calm as a frozen lake. I saw the shell company payments. And I saw how you used the sterling contract, the one I fixed for you, to secure a private loan to cover your tracks. That's not corporate theater. That's a felony. He recoiled as if I'd slapped him, his breath coming in short, ragged gasps. Then, his face changed. The desperation turned into something uglier, a forced, greasy kind of warmth. He reached across the table again, this time keeping his hands open in a gesture of supplication. Look, I know I was a jerk at the party. I was stressed, okay? I was drinking. I didn't mean those things about the dress or you being a failure. You're my sister, Cassie. We're blood. You've always been the one who had my back. You're the shadow fixer, remember? That's your role. You fix things. So, fix this. Just write the report saying the department is clean. Tell Ramsay that the discrepancies were just clerical errors that have already been resolved. If you do that, I'll make sure you get a cut. A real cut. Not just some measly consulting fee. I'll give you 100,000 for my bonus. I felt a cold shiver go down my spine. He was trying to bribe me with the money he'd stolen from the very company I was hired to protect. He was asking me to sell my soul to keep his facade from cracking. I'm not the shadow fixer anymore, Parker, I told him, looking him straight in his bloodshot eyes. I'm the auditor. And the auditor doesn't take bribes from the people she's investigating. His face contorted, the mask of warmth slipping away to reveal a desperate, cornered animal. You think you're so much better than us, don't you? Sitting there with your boring logic and your moral high ground. You're nothing without this family. If you tank this merger, Mom and Dad will never forgive you. They'll cast you out for real this time. You'll be the one who destroyed the Miller name. Is that what you want? To be the girl who burned down her own house just to prove she was right? He slammed his hand on the table, making the spoons rattle. Back the family, Cassandra. Just this once, put your pride away and back the family. We're supposed to protect each other. If you don't sign off on those books, you're dead to us. Do you hear me? Dead. I didn't flinch. I just picked up my coffee, took a slow sip, and set it back down. The fear I'd lived with for 40 years, the fear of their rejection, it just wasn't there anymore. It had been replaced by a quiet, steady flame of self-respect. You're not asking me to back the family, Parker, I said quietly. You're asking me to join you in the gutter. And I've spent too much time cleaning the mud off your shoes to ever want to lie down in the dirt with you. The audit stays. The report will be accurate. If that destroys the house you built on sand, then maybe it's a house that deserves to fall. He stood up so fast his chair screeched against the floor. He looked at me with a hatred so pure it was almost breathtaking. You'll regret this, he spat. I'm not going down alone, Cassie. If I go, I'm taking everyone with me, and I'll make sure the world knows you were my clerical assistant the whole time. I'll make it look like it was your idea. He turned and bolted out the door, leaving the bell ringing behind him. I sat there in the silence, watching the steam rise from my cup. I knew what was coming next. A man that desperate doesn't go home and pray, he goes home and plans. He was going to try to frame me. He was going to try to turn my own shadow work against me. But what Parker forgot, what he always forgot, is that I'm the one who knows how the machines are built. And if you try to sabotage a machine while the engineer is watching, you're the one who's going to get caught in the gears. When a man like Parker realizes his charm won't buy him a way out, he doesn't suddenly find a conscience, honey. No, he just finds a sharper knife to twist. I knew that coffee shop confrontation wasn't the end, it was just the opening bell. 2 days later, I was back in my executive office at Ramsay Logistics, the morning light filtering through the blinds in long, thin strips, when I felt a strange shift in the atmosphere. You know that feeling when the birds suddenly stop singing before a storm hits? That was the office that morning. People were whispering at the water cooler, and every time I walked past, their eyes would dart away, landing anywhere but on me. Theodore hadn't called me for our morning briefing, which was the first red flag. By 10 o'clock, my internal server access was suddenly temporarily suspended for maintenance. Now, honey, I've been around computers since they were the size of a refrigerator, and I know that maintenance is often just a polite word for a digital padlock. My heart started that slow, heavy thud again. I sat back, folded my hands on my desk, and waited. I didn't have to wait long. The door to my office swung open, and it wasn't just Theodore who walked in. He was flanked by 2 men from the legal department, men with gray suits and expressions that looked like they'd been carved out of granite. Theodore didn't look angry, he looked disappointed, which hurt far worse. He didn't sit down. He just laid a stack of printed emails on my desk. Cassandra, he said, his voice flat and weary. We received an anonymous tip this morning. Someone suggested that your investigation into the logistics department might be a smokescreen. They provided these. I picked up the papers. My hands were steady, even if my soul felt like it was treading water. I looked at the first page. It was an email, supposedly from my private account to Parker's work address, dated 6 months ago. The words on the page made my skin crawl. It said, Parker, I've adjusted the fuel hedge numbers for the 3rd quarter. If anyone asks, tell them the data was corrupted during the server migration. My fee remains 10% of the saved overhead. Make sure the wire goes to the usual offshore account. There were dozens of them. A trail of digital breadcrumbs stretching back over a year, all painting a picture of me as the mastermind and Parker as the unwitting puppet. There were emails where I coached him on how to lie to the board, emails where I bragged about how easy it was to manipulate the Ramsay audits, and even one where I laughed about how Theodore would never suspect his ghost of Arcus. It was a masterpiece of malice, honey. Parker had used everything he knew about me, my history of helping him, my private email address, even my specific way of phrasing technical terms, to build a digital noose. He'd even gone so far as to discover a hidden folder on the server that supposedly contained my private ledgers for the fraud. "The evidence is quite compelling," Cassandra, one of the legal men, said, his voice as cold as a mountain stream. "The IP addresses match your home network. The timestamps align with the nights you were logged into the system. It looks like you've been using your brother as a front for a very lucrative embezzlement scheme for years, and now that the merger is happening, you're trying to pin the whole thing on him to cover your tracks." I looked up from the papers, and I saw Theodore watching me, his eyes searching mine for even a flicker of guilt. I knew what he was thinking. He was thinking he'd been a fool to trust the ghost after all these years. He was thinking my family was right about me, that I was the broken one, the failure who had finally turned to crime to get what she thought she deserved. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I didn't tell them it wasn't me, not yet. Instead, I felt a strange, cold calm wash over me. I looked at those emails and I saw the flaws. You see, Parker is a man of broad strokes, but he's never been one for the details. He's like a person who paints a beautiful landscape but forgets to put the shadows in the right place. "Theodore," I said, my voice quiet and steady. "Do you remember what you told me the first day you came to my house? You said you needed my eyes because I could see the ghost in the machine. You said you trusted my logic." I stood up and walked over to my computer, even though the screen was locked. "These emails look like my voice. They look like my habits. But they have one fatal flaw. Parker knows how I talk, and he knows where I live, but he doesn't understand how I think. He thinks a digital trail is something you can just manufacture with a few clicks and a clever spoofing tool." I turned back to the men in the gray suits. "If you give me 10 minutes with your systems administrator, I won't just prove these are fakes. I'll show you exactly which terminal they were sent from, the specific software used to forge the headers, and the fact that the offshore account mentioned in these emails was opened 3 weeks ago using a stolen identity that I can trace back to a certain brother's personal laptop." The legal men looked at each other, skeptical, but Theodore stepped forward. He looked at the papers, then he looked at me. "Give her the access," he commanded. "Theodore, we shouldn't," the lawyer started. "Give her the access," Theodore repeated, his voice dropping an octave. "If she's the woman I think she is, she's about to give us a master class. And if she's the woman you think she is, she'll just hang herself with the extra rope. Either way, I want the truth." As they led me toward the IT department, I felt a grim sort of satisfaction. Parker had spent his whole life thinking he was the hunter and I was the prey. He thought he could use the tools of my own trade to bury me. But you don't try to frame a forensic accountant using a digital paper trail, honey. That's like trying to trick a locksmith with a plastic key. I knew Parker was probably sitting in his office right now, clutching a glass of scotch and waiting for the security guards to escort me out of the building. He thought he'd won. He thought he'd finally put the family failure in her place. But as the IT manager opened the door to the server room, I realized that the digital frame-up wasn't my ending. It was the evidence I needed to finish the job. Parker hadn't just handed me a noose for myself, he'd handed me the keys to his prison cell. Now, honey, there's a special kind of quiet that lives in a server room. It's not a peaceful quiet, it's a high-pitched, electric hum, the sound of millions of secrets rushing through fiber optic cables at the speed of light. As I sat down at that terminal with Theodore and those stone-faced lawyers hovering over my shoulder, I felt more at home than I ever did at a family Sunday dinner. To my family, I was just the girl who was good with clerical things, but in this room, I was the master of the house. I didn't rush. I've learned over 41 years that if you want to catch a rat, you have to let him think he's already made it back to his hole. I pulled up the header data on those forged emails first. Now, to the untrained eye, or even to a lazy IT manager, an email looks like it comes from a specific person at a specific time. But to someone who knows how to look, an email is a roadmap with 1,000 tiny footprints. "Look here, Theodore," I said, my fingers dancing across the keys. I could feel the lawyers leaning in, their skepticism starting to give way to a nervous sort of curiosity. Parker used a basic VPN to spoof my home IP address. He thought that by making it look like the signal came from my house, the case would be closed. But he's a man who skips the fine print. He used a free version of a masking software, the kind teenagers use to bypass school filters. It's cheap, it's sloppy, and it leaves a digital watermark in the packet headers that's as unique as a thumbprint. I pulled up the system logs for the office's internal Wi-Fi from the night those emails were supposedly sent. "Now, watch this," I whispered. I felt a surge of that cold, surgical clarity. The emails were sent from my account at 11:14 p.m. on a Tuesday. The logs show my home router was active, yes. But if we cross-reference the office security logs for that exact same minute, we find a device, Parker's personal laptop, connected to the executive lounge Wi-Fi. And look at the outbound traffic. I hit a final key, and a jagged graph appeared on the screen, showing a spike of data leaving Parker's machine at the precise second the forgery landed in the company's inbox. But I wasn't done. A trap isn't truly set until you lock the door from both sides. He tried to make it look like I was transferring money to an offshore account, I continued, my voice steady and warm, like I was explaining a recipe for peach cobbler. But when I look at the metadata for the account creation, the shadow consultant profile he built for me was created using a recovery phone number. He thought he'd hidden it behind an encrypted layer, but he used the same secondary email address he's had since college, the one our mother still uses to send him his birthday checks. He's so used to having people clean up after him that he forgot that out here, in the real world, your mistakes stay exactly where you left them. One of the lawyers cleared his throat, his face pale. "You're saying he didn't just forge the emails, he did it from inside this building, using his own credentials as a backdoor?" "I'm saying he was so desperate to frame me that he left a trail a mile wide," I replied. "He wanted to show you a ghost, but all he did was provide a confession in digital ink. Look at the file properties on the attachments. They weren't created on my machine. They were drafted on a version of Word registered to P. Miller. He didn't even bother to scrub the author field in the XML data. He spent so long being told he's a genius that he truly believed no one would ever be smart enough to look behind the curtain." Theodore stepped closer to the monitor, his eyes fixed on the evidence. I could see the anger simmering just beneath his skin, but it wasn't directed at me anymore. The disappointment I'd seen earlier had transformed into a cold, corporate fury. He realized that the man he'd almost let destroy his merger wasn't just a thief, Il was a man who would ruin his own sister's life just to save his own skin. "Can you trace the $14,000? Theodore asked, his voice like a gavel striking a marble floor. "I already have," I said, pulling up the final screen. It didn't go to an offshore account. It went from my personal savings into a holding account Parker used to patch a hole in the escrow he'd been raiding for months. My bribe was actually my own money, which I gave him because he came to me crying like a child. He used my kindness as the foundation for his frame-up. I stood up then, my legs feeling strong and certain. I handed a thumb drive to Theodore, containing every log, every IP trace, and every piece of metadata that proved Parker's guilt beyond a shadow of a doubt. The forensic trap had snapped shut, and the only thing left inside was the golden boy's pride. "Theodore," I said, looking him in the eye, "for 15 years, I worked in the shadows because I thought that's where I belonged. I thought my value was in the things I kept from breaking. But I realize now that some things need to break. This report isn't just about the audit anymore. It's about the truth. And the truth is, Parker Miller is a liability you can no longer afford." Theodore took the drive, his grip firm. He looked at the legal team and then back at me. "Cassandra, go back to your office. Take the rest of the day. You've done more than fix a machine today. You've saved this company from a cancer. And as for your brother, well, I think it's time he had a very different kind of meeting in the boardroom." As I walked out of that server room, the hum of the machines felt like a round of applause. I knew that by tomorrow, the family failure would be the talk of the firm, but for all the right reasons. Parker's digital lies had been stripped away, leaving him standing naked in the light of the facts I'd gathered. I'd spent my life being his shadow, but today, I was the sun, and the shadows were finally starting to disappear. The next morning, the air in the executive wing felt heavy, like the sky right before a cyclone hits. Theodore had asked me to come in early, but not to the boardroom. Instead, he led me into a small, darkened observation room separated from the main conference chamber by a massive sheet of one-way glass. It was cold in there, and the only sound was the soft hum of the air conditioning. I stood in the dark, looking through that glass at the long mahogany table where my brother was already seated, looking for all the world like he'd already won the lottery. Parker was wearing his finest charcoal suit, his hair slicked back to perfection, leaning back in his chair with a smirk that turned my stomach. He was joking with one of the junior VPs, acting like he was the guest of honor at his own coronation. He truly believed that his digital frame-up had worked. He thought I was currently at home, packing my bags and leaping into my tea, while he stepped into the vacuum I'd left behind. Then, the door opened, and the board members filed in, 7 men and women with faces like stone. Theodore came in last, carrying the thumb drive I'd given him like it was a live grenade. The room went silent. Parker's smirk faltered just a hair, but he recovered quickly, sitting up straight and putting on that golden boy mask of concerned integrity. "Theodore," Parker said, his voice smooth as silk. "I'm glad we're handling this quickly. It's a tragedy, really, about Cassandra. I always knew she struggled with resentment, but to find out she was sabotaging the merger for personal gain, well, it breaks my heart. But the family will stand by the company. We'll help clean up the mess she made." Theodore didn't say a word. He just walked to the head of the table, plugged the drive into the system, and hit a key. The massive screen at the end of the room flickered to life, and instead of the forged emails Parker expected to see, there was a giant, high-resolution map of the company's internal Wi-Fi traffic. "Parker, Theodore said, and his voice was so cold I felt a shiver even behind the glass. I want you to tell the board about the software Tunnel Vision VPN. Do you find it effective for bypassing security protocols? Parker's face went from pale to a ghostly, translucent white in a matter of seconds. I don't know what you're talking about, Ted. Is that some IT thing Cassandra was using? No, Theodore replied, clicking to the next slide. It's a tool used from your personal laptop, MAC address matching your employee ID, logged into the executive lounge at 11:14 p.m. last Tuesday. The same minute those confessions from your sister were sent. And look at this next screen, Parker. This is the metadata from the Word documents you used to draft the fraud logs. It seems the author of those files wasn't Cassandra Miller. It was a user named P. Money Miller. I assume that's you? A few of the board members let out a sharp, collective intake of breath. Parker started to stammer, his hands beginning to shake so violently he had to tuck them under the table. That's impossible. She must have hacked my computer. She's always been jealous. She's trying to frame me for the things she did. Enough. Theodore's voice cracked like a whip. We've spent the last 6 hours with a third-party forensic team. They didn't just find your digital fingerprints on the forgeries, Parker. They found the trail of the $14,000 you stole from the escrow account, the money your sister actually gave you out of her own pocket to keep you from going to jail. You didn't just steal from this company, you tried to destroy the only person in this world who was still willing to save you. One of the female board members leaned forward, her eyes narrowing with pure disgust. Mr. Miller, we've also reviewed the Sterling account restructuring. The logic in those files is brilliant, but it's inconsistent with every other report you've ever filed in your 3-year tenure. It's become quite clear that you haven't done a lick of actual work since you got here. You've been a parasite on your sister's intellect, and when she finally stopped letting you feed, you tried to kill the host. Parker looked around the room, his eyes wide and wild, searching for a friendly face, a way out, a lie that would stick. But there was nothing but a wall of iron. He was trapped. The charm that had worked on our parents for 40 years, the smile that had smoothed over 1,000 mistakes, it was useless here. In this room, only the numbers mattered. And the numbers said he was a thief and a fraud. I can explain, Parker whimpered, his voice now a high, pathetic thinness. I was under a lot of pressure. The wedding, the family expectations. I just needed a little more time to get things right. You're out of time, Parker, Theodore said, standing up. You are terminated, effective immediately, for cause. We will be retaining your final compensation to begin the process of restitution for the escrow theft. Furthermore, the evidence gathered by our lead auditor, the woman you called a failure, has already been forwarded to the district attorney's office. I'd expect a visit from them by the end of the business day. Parker collapsed back into his chair as if his bones had turned to water. He looked small. For the first time in my life, I didn't see the golden boy. I saw a hollow, frightened man who had finally run out of other people's light to hide in. He started to sob, a messy, ugly sound that echoed through the speakers into my little dark room. Ted, please, he gasped through his tears. Don't do this. Think of my parents. Think of the scandal. Cassandra wouldn't want this. She's family. Cassandra is the one who found the evidence, Parker, Theodore said, looking directly at the one-way glass, though he couldn't see me. And for the record, she didn't ask for revenge. She just asked for the truth. It's the truth that's destroying you, not her. Theodore signaled to the security guards waiting by the door. They walked over and lifted Parker out of his chair. He didn't even try to walk out with dignity. He stumbled, his expensive suit rumpled, his face a mask of snot and tears, as they led him down the hallway toward the freight elevator. I stood there in the dark for a long time after the room cleared out. I felt a strange, hollow sensation in my chest. It wasn't joy. It wasn't the fury the hashtags talk about. It was just peace. The weight of the lie was finally gone. The golden child had fallen, and for the first time in 41 years, I didn't have to be the one to pick him up. I turned away from the glass, walked out of the observation room, and headed back to my desk. I had a merger to finish, honey, and for the first time, I was doing it for myself. A week had passed since the walls came tumbling down at the office, but the air in the family was still thick with a fog of denial. It was Aunt Irene who called the meeting. Now, Aunt Irene was the one we all called the quiet observer. She was my mother's older sister, a woman who lived in a small, vine-covered cottage on the edge of town and spent more time with her garden than with people. She didn't say much at the big family galas, but her eyes, oh, honey, Irene had eyes like a hawk. She saw the things people tried to hide in the shadows of their smiles. She invited us all to dinner on a Tuesday night. It wasn't a request, it was a summons. When I pulled up to her house, the porch light was a lonely amber glow against the purple mountain twilight. Inside, the table was set with the fine china, the stuff with the delicate blue cornflowers that only came out for funerals or christenings. My parents were already there, sitting stiffly on the velvet sofa, looking like they'd aged 10 years in 7 days. My father's hand was shaking as he held a glass of water, and my mother was staring at a painting on the wall as if she could disappear into the canvas. The tension in that room was so thick you could have cut it with a butter knife. It was a suffocating, heavy silence, broken only by the rhythmic ticking of Irene's grandfather clock. But the most deafening thing in the room was the empty chair. Savannah, Parker's fiancée, was noticeably absent. She'd scrubbed her social media of every trace of him the moment the news of the audit discrepancies hit the grapevine. She was gone like a summer mist, taking her designer luggage and her polished smile with her, leaving Parker to face the music alone. "Sit down, Cassandra," Aunt Irene said, her voice soft but carrying the weight of a mountain. She didn't look at my parents. She just pointed to the chair across from them. "The soup is getting cold." We sat in a silence that felt like a physical weight. My mother finally broke it, her voice trembling with a jagged, hysterical edge. "I just don't understand it, Cassandra. How could you do it? How could you go to that man, that Mr. Ramsay, and tell those lies about your brother? Parker he's sensitive. He's a dreamer. He might have made a few mistakes, but to involve the police? To humiliate him in front of the board? You've destroyed this family's reputation. People are talking at the club, Cassie. They're whispering about the Miller name like it's something dirty." My father finally looked at me, and his eyes weren't full of the pity I'd seen at the lodge. They were full of a cold, redirected anger. He was the one who was going to take care of us, Cassandra. He had the career. He had the future. You were always just comfortable. You didn't need the spotlight. Why did you have to pull him down? Was your jealousy really worth seeing your brother in a jumpsuit? I looked at them, really looked at them, and for the first time, I didn't feel that desperate need to explain myself. I didn't feel the urge to show them the spreadsheets or the IP logs. I realized that to them, the truth was an inconvenience. They didn't care that Parker had stolen, they only cared that he'd been caught. They didn't care that I'd been the one keeping them all afloat, they only cared that I'd finally stopped. He didn't have a future, I said quietly, my voice steady in the face of their storm. He had a mountain of debt and a trail of forged documents. I didn't pull him down. I just stepped out of the way so he could finally feel the gravity of his own choices. Choices? My mother practically shrieked, her lace napkin crumpled in her fist. He was doing it for us. He wanted to make us proud. And Savannah, that poor girl, is heartbroken. Her family is mortified. Do you have any idea what this has done to our social standing? Aunt Irene set her spoon down with a sharp clink against the porcelain. She looked at my mother, then at my father, and then she turned those hawk-like eyes toward me. Reputation, Irene whispered, the word sounding like a curse. You all are so worried about the paint on the house that you haven't noticed the foundation has been rotting for 40 years. She leaned forward, the candlelight casting long, dancing shadows across her face. You talk about Parker's future, but who do you think paid for your bypass surgery 3 years ago, David? You thought it was an insurance settlement that came through just in time, didn't you? My father blinked, his mouth falling open slightly. Well, yes. The paperwork was handled by Parker's office. Irene let out a short, bitter laugh. Parker's office handled the paperwork, all right. But the money came from a private wire transfer from a local consulting firm. A little project account. It was Cassandra's money, David. Every cent of it. She swore me to secrecy because she knew you were too proud to take help from the daughter you called a disappointment. The room went deathly still. My mother looked at me, her eyes wide and searching. I just stared at my soup, the steam rising up to meet my face. I hadn't wanted them to know. Not like this. But Irene wasn't finished. And what about the business loans for Mark? Irene continued, her voice gaining strength. And the taxes on this very house when you overextended yourselves on that Florida property? You think Parker was the one managing those crises? He was the one causing them. It was Cassandra who was working until 4 in the morning to balance the books you were too lazy to read. She's been the quiet observer of your failures for a lifetime, and all she got for it was a seat at the end of the table and a joke at her expense. The silence that followed wasn't like the one at the lodge. This was a heavy, shameful silence. My father looked at his hands as if he didn't recognize them. My mother's face went pale, the reality of 40 years of misplaced pride finally starting to crack the surface of her denial. I looked at the empty chair where Savannah should have been, and I thought about the golden boy who was currently sitting in a cold room with a public defender. He wasn't there to defend them. He wasn't there to save the family name. The only person who had ever truly done that was sitting right here, being blamed for the very truth that was finally setting them free from their own delusions. The tension in this room isn't because of what I did, I said, looking my parents in the eye. It's because for the first time in your lives, you're seeing the world without the filter Parker gave you. You're seeing me. And I think that's what's really making you uncomfortable. Aunt Irene reached across the table and squeezed my hand. Her skin was like parchment, but her grip was like iron. Eat your soup, Cassandra, she said, a small, sad smile touching her lips. The truth is a bitter meal at first, but it's the only thing that actually nourishes the soul. The rest of you, well, I suggest you start looking at the ledger of your own hearts. Because the girl who's been paying your debts just went out of business. Aunt Irene didn't just stop at the surgery, honey. She had the look of a woman who had been carrying a heavy sack of stones for a decade and was finally ready to set them down, one by one, right on the middle of that lace tablecloth. She leaned back, her eyes sharp and gleaming in the candlelight, and she looked at my mother, her own sister, with a pity that was sharper than any insult. You like to talk about legacy, Evelyn, Irene said, her voice dropping into a low, rhythmic cadence. You like to talk about who made it and who didn't. But while you were busy bragging about Parker's new country club membership, do you remember 5 years ago? Do you remember when the doctors found that mass in my lung and told me the insurance wouldn't cover the experimental trials at the university hospital? My mother blinked, her hand fluttering to her throat. Well, of course, Irene. We all prayed for you. And we were so relieved when that anonymous medical grant was approved. We thought it was a miracle. Irene let out a dry, hollow laugh that echoed off the high ceiling. A miracle? No, Evelyn. It wasn't a miracle. It was a wire transfer. I found out by accident 3 months into my treatment. I saw a slip of paper I wasn't meant to see at the billing office. That anonymous grant came from an LLC called CM Strategic Turnarounds. Do you want to guess who the sole proprietor of that company is? It's the daughter you told to sit in the corner and stay out of the way. Cassandra didn't just pray for me. She worked 80-hour weeks for 1.5 years to pay for my life, dollar by painful dollar, while Parker was out leasing a Mercedes he couldn't afford. The color drained from my mother's face, leaving her looking gray and fragile. But Irene wasn't through. She turned her gaze toward my father, who was staring at his wine glass like it contained poison. And then there's Mark, Irene continued, referring to my favorite cousin. Remember when his landscaping business nearly went under during the drought? He was 2 weeks away from losing his trucks, his equipment, and his home. He went to Parker for a loan, a little bridge to get him through the season. And Parker told him he didn't associate with failing ventures and showed him the door. I remember that day, honey. I remembered Mark sitting on my porch, his head in his hands, smelling of gasoline and desperation. I hadn't said a word to anyone. I just walked into my office, liquidated a small investment account, and told him I'd found a private investor who specialized in green growth small businesses. Mark didn't get a loan from a bank, David, Irene said to my father. He got a check from Cassandra. She told him it was an investment from a silent partner. She even wrote up a professional contract so he wouldn't feel like he was taking charity. He's been paying her back with interest for 3 years, and do you know what she's been doing with that interest? She's been putting it into a college fund for Mark's kids. The kids Parker wouldn't even acknowledge at the last family reunion. My father finally found his voice, though it was nothing more than a raspy whisper. Cassandra, why? Why wouldn't you tell us? Why let us think? Why let us say those things to you? I looked at him, and I felt a strange, quiet sadness. Because if I had to tell you, Dad, then it wouldn't have been about helping them. It would have been about proving you wrong. And for a long time, I thought that if I just did enough, if I was just the perfect, invisible support system, you'd eventually see me on your own. I thought the love would come if I earned enough of it for all of us. You shouldn't have had to earn it, child, Irene said, her voice softening for the first time that night. She looked at her sister and brother-in-law with a terrifying clarity. You two fed the wolf and starved the sheep. You let Parker believe he was a king while he was nothing but a thief, and you let Cassandra believe she was a failure while she was the only thing keeping this entire family from the poorhouse. You didn't just misjudge her. You used her. You used her brilliance to cushion your own comfort and then mocked the very hands that held you up. Irene stood up then, the chair scraping loudly against the hardwood floor. She walked over to the sideboard and picked up a thick manila envelope, tossing it onto the table in front of my parents. It landed with a heavy, final thud. In there, Irene said, are the records of every clerical error Cassandra fixed for you over the last decade. The taxes, the medical bills, the business bailouts. It's all there. Every bit of boring work she did while you were busy celebrating the golden boy's latest lie. I kept the records because I knew this day would come. I knew Parker would eventually burn the house down, and I wanted to make sure you knew exactly who was left standing in the ashes with a bucket of water. My mother reached out a trembling hand and touched the envelope, but she didn't open it. She didn't have to. The truth wasn't in the papers anymore, it was in the room, thick and unavoidable. She looked at me, her eyes brimming with a sudden, sharp realization of what she'd lost. We didn't know, Cassie, she stammered. We thought you were just settled. No, Mom, I said, my voice finally finding its strength. I wasn't settled. I was working. I was building. I was loving you in the only way I knew how, by making sure your world didn't fall apart. But the bill is due now. Not the money, I don't want the money back. But the lie. The lie is finished. You don't get to call me a failure anymore. And you don't get to use my life to pay for Parker's mistakes. Aunt Irene walked behind me and placed her hands on my shoulders. They were thin hands, honey, but they felt like a suit of armor. The truth bombs have dropped, Evelyn, she said quietly. Now you have to decide if you want to keep living in a fantasy, or if you're finally ready to ask your daughter for forgiveness. But don't expect it to be free. Forgiveness is the only thing Cassandra hasn't already paid for on your behalf. The dinner was over. The soup was cold, the wine was sour, and the family I had known my whole life was gone, replaced by something much more honest and much more painful. I stood up, kissed Irene on the cheek, and walked out into the cool mountain night. I didn't look back to see if they were following. I had spent 41 years looking back. From now on, I was only looking at the road ahead. I thought the air couldn't get any thinner in that room, but as I moved toward the door, Aunt Irene's voice rang out, stopping me dead in my tracks. It wasn't the voice of a gardener or a quiet aunt anymore. It was the voice of a judge delivering a final, crushing sentence. She wasn't done with them, honey. Not by a long shot. There was one more stone in her sack, and it was the heaviest one of all. Sit back down, Cassandra, Irene commanded. And David, Evelyn, look at your daughter. Look at her and remember the year she turned 18. Do you remember how she wept when she told us she couldn't go to her first choice university? Do you remember telling her that the market had dipped and her college fund had simply vanished into thin air? My mother's face went from pale to a ghastly, translucent white. She tried to speak, her mouth working like a fish out of water, but no sound came out. My father, on the other hand, turned his gaze to the far corner of the room, his jaw set in a hard, stubborn line that I had seen 1,000 times before. I remember, I whispered, the memory hitting me like a physical blow. I remembered the brochures I'd tucked under my pillow, the late nights I'd spent dreaming of that campus on the coast, and the way my heart had shattered when they told me the $50,000 my grandfather had left specifically for me was just gone. They told me I'd have to stay local, work 2 jobs, and be sensible while Parker went off to his private ivy-covered halls. The market didn't dip, Cassandra, Irene said, her eyes boring into my parents with a righteous fury. I saw the ledger, Evelyn. I was there the night you and David sat in this very kitchen and decided that Parker needed a certain image to succeed. You took every penny of Cassandra's inheritance, the money Grandpa Silas worked 40 years in the coal mines to save, and you used it to pay for Parker's fraternity dues, his spring break trips to Europe, and that silver watch he still wears like a badge of honor. The silence that followed was different than before. It wasn't just heavy, it felt poisonous. I looked at my mother, waiting for her to deny it, waiting for her to tell me Irene was mistaken. But she just slumped in her chair, a single, silent tear tracking through her expensive powder. We thought it was an investment, my father finally growled, his voice defensive and jagged. We thought if we gave Parker the best start, he'd reach a position where he could take care of all of us, Cassandra included. We were doing what was best for the family unit. Cassandra was always, she was resilient. We knew she could handle a local school. We knew she'd find a way. But Parker, he needed that edge. He needed to be among the elite. I felt a coldness settle in my chest that I knew would never truly leave. An investment? I asked, my voice barely a thread. You stole my future to polish his ego. You took the one thing I had that was truly mine and you handed it to a boy who didn't even know how to balance a checkbook. And then, for 20 years, you let me feel like I was the burden. You let me feel like I was lucky you were even letting me live in your shadow. We were going to pay it back, my mother cried out, her voice cracking. We truly intended to, Cassie. But then there was the house, and Parker's first business failure, and we got overextended. We thought you didn't mind. You never complained. You just kept working and helping, and we assumed you'd moved past it. I didn't complain because I believed you. I shouted, the volume of my own voice startling me. I believed that life was just unfair and that I had to work twice as hard as everyone else just to stay level. I didn't know the people who were supposed to be my sanctuary were the ones who had robbed me in my sleep. Irene stood over them, looking down like an avenging angel. You didn't just steal her money, David. You stole her confidence. You spent decades calling her unambitious and settled when the truth was you'd clipped her wings before she ever had a chance to fly. You let her pay for your surgeries and your debts with money she earned with her own sweat, all while you were sitting on the secret that you'd already taken $50,000 from her when she was just a child. She turned to me, her eyes softening. Cassandra, you've spent 41 years trying to be the good daughter to people who didn't deserve a second of your time. You've been the pillar of a house built on theft and lies. Look at them. Really look at them. Are these the people you're still trying to save? I looked at my parents. They looked small. They looked like strangers I'd met by accident in a cold, dark room. The pedestal I'd kept them on for my entire life had finally crumbled into dust. They weren't the wise, guiding lights of my childhood, they were just two people who had played favorites until they bankrupted their own souls. I'm done, I said, and the words felt like a heavy door closing. I'm not the family fixer. I'm not the disappointment. And I'm certainly not the bank. You took my inheritance, you took my reputation, and you tried to take my dignity. But you forgot one thing. You can steal a person's money, but you can't steal their talent. I built a life out of the scraps you left me, and I'm taking it with me. I picked up my purse and walked to the door. This time, I didn't hesitate. I didn't wait for an apology, because I knew there wasn't one in the world big enough to cover the debt. Cassie, wait, my mother wailed, but the sound was distant, like a radio station losing its signal. Let her go, Evelyn, I heard Irene say as the screen door clicked shut behind me. She's been carrying you for 40 years. It's about time you learned how to walk on your own. I stepped out onto the porch and breathed in the cold, night air. It was sharp, and it stung my lungs, but for the first time in my life, it felt like I was breathing for myself. The golden child was in a cell, the family fortune was a lie, and the failure was walking away into a moonlight that finally belonged to her. It's funny how we fear silence, isn't it? We spend our lives filling the air with explanations, apologies, and the noise of other people's expectations because we think the quiet will swallow us whole. But let me tell you, honey, after I walked off Aunt Irene's porch that night, the silence that followed wasn't a void. It was a sanctuary. It's been 1 year since I made the decision to initiate what the professionals call no contact. To me, it felt more like an amputation. It was painful, yes, and there were nights I felt the phantom itch of a life I no longer led, but it was necessary to save the rest of the body. I remember the first few weeks the most. My phone was a battlefield. My mother sent a barrage of messages that swung wildly from "how could you be so cruel" to "we miss our little girl." My father sent one formal email, not asking for forgiveness, but asking if I could advise on the legal fees for Parker's defense. I didn't reply. I didn't block them at first, I just watched the messages come in like waves hitting a lighthouse. I realized that they weren't reaching out to me because they loved Cassandra. They were reaching out because the bridge was gone, and they were stuck on an island of their own making. For 41 years, I had been the interpreter, the banker, and the emotional glue. Without me, they had to actually talk to each other, and they realized they had nothing to say. The process of severance is a slow shedding of skin. I had to unlearn the habit of checking my bank account to see if a family emergency had drained it. I had to stop flinching when I saw a midnight black sedan, thinking it was Theodore bringing more bad news, though, as it turned out, Theodore only ever brought opportunities. I moved out of that little house with the lace curtains. It was a lovely place, but it was haunted by the ghost of Arcus and the family failure. I bought a home with high ceilings and windows that look out over a valley where the light stays golden long after the sun has dipped below the peaks. In that year of silence, I grew. Not just in spirit, honey, but in stature. I took that $250,000 contract from Theodore and I didn't just fulfill it, I demolished it. I built a firm of my own, Miller Strategic Partners. I kept the name. Why shouldn't I? I'm the only one who ever did the work to make that name mean anything. I hired people who, like me, had been overlooked, the quiet ones, the meticulous ones, the ones who see the cracks before the building falls. My office isn't a shadow anymore. It's on the 24th floor, all glass and steady, rhythmic energy. When I walk through those doors, nobody looks through me. They look to me. And the best part? The most delicious, quiet victory of it all? I don't do it to prove my parents wrong anymore. I do it because I love the way a complicated ledger finally balances. I do it for the thrill of the logic, the beauty of the fix. The peace of the silence is what surprised me the most. Without the constant hum of Parker's crises or my mother's backhanded compliments, my mind became a clear, still lake. I started painting again, not the unconventional hobbies my father mocked, but real, vibrant landscapes. I traveled to the coast and stood on the campus of that university I never got to attend. I didn't feel sad. I just looked at the water and realized that the $50,000 they stole was a drop in the ocean compared to the value of the woman I became because I had to survive without it. I heard through Aunt Irene, the only link I kept, that the family home was sold. My parents moved into a small condo, and Parker is serving his time, learning that P. Money Miller doesn't hold much weight in a state facility. It's a tragedy, I suppose, but it's a tragedy I no longer have to co-author. I sat on my new balcony last night, a glass of good wine in my hand and a thick, profitable contract on my lap. The phone didn't ring. There was no emergency. No clerical error to fix in the dark of the night. There was just the wind through the pines and the steady beating of my own heart. I used to think that being a failure was the worst thing that could happen to a person. But I was wrong, honey. The worst thing is being a success for people who will never love you for it. The total severance wasn't an act of anger. It was an act of housekeeping. I cleared the clutter of toxic expectations out of my life to make room for the person I was always meant to be. And as I looked out at the valley, watching the lights of the city twinkle like 1,000 tiny victories, I realized that the silence wasn't empty at all. It was full of me. So here I am, sitting by the fire as the embers glow a soft, tired orange, looking back at the wreckage and the flowers that grew out of it. It's funny how time has a way of sorting us all out, like a river washing away the silt until only the heavy stones are left at the bottom. The story of the Miller family didn't end with a bang or a big, cinematic hug. It ended with the quiet, steady ticking of reality. I heard from Aunt Irene that Parker's world has shrunk down to the size of a small, concrete room. He's serving 3 to 5 years for the escrow fraud. Apparently, he still tells anyone who will listen that he's a corporate visionary who just got caught in a temporary political squeeze. Some people never change, honey. They just find new audiences for their old lies. He spends his days in the prison library, not reading the law, but looking through old business magazines, still searching for a shortcut that doesn't exist. He reached out once, a handwritten letter on yellow legal paper, asking if I could leverage my connection with Theodore to get his sentence commuted. I didn't even finish reading it before I set it in the fireplace. You see, Parker doesn't miss me, he misses the safety net I provided. And a net that's been cut can't catch a man who refuses to learn how to fly. As for my parents, they've moved into a 2-bedroom condo in a retirement community 3 towns over. The big lodge, the custom furniture, the Miller reputation, it all went up in the smoke of Parker's legal fees and the restitution they had to pay to keep their own names out of the indictments. They live in a world of muted colors and hushed voices now. Aunt Irene says my mother still keeps a photo of Parker on the mantle, the one of him in his graduation gown, but she's moved the photo of me into the hallway. I think it hurts her to look at it. It's a reminder not of what I did to them, but of what they did to themselves. They sit at that small kitchen table, eating their meals in a silence that must feel like a lead weight. They have each other, I suppose, but when your entire marriage was built on the vanity of a golden child, there's not much left to talk about once the gold starts to flake off and reveal the rust underneath. Irene told me my father spends a lot of time at the local park, just sitting on a bench, watching the young families play. I wonder if he looks at the little girls and tries to spot the ones who are doing the heavy lifting while their brothers get the cheers. I wonder if he finally understands that by investing my future into Parker's ego, he ended up losing both. I don't wish them ill, I truly don't. But I've learned that pity is a very different thing from proximity. I can forgive them from across the valley, but I won't let them back into the house I've built with my own hands. And then there's me. People ask me sometimes if I feel vindicated. They use that word like it's a prize I won. But vindication implies that I still needed them to admit I was right. And that's the biggest lesson of this whole long, winding road, honey. I spent 41 years trying to prove my kindness, my worth, and my brilliance to people who were committed to miscalculating my value. I thought if I just fixed one more contract, paid one more bill, or took one more insult with a smile, the scales would finally tip and they'd see me. But the truth is, kindness doesn't need to be proven to those who won't see it. If you have to shine a spotlight on your heart just to get someone to acknowledge its beating, then they aren't your people. My worth wasn't something for them to grant or deny, it was a fact, like the North Star, whether they chose to look up or not. Theodore and I still work together. We've become a formidable team, the lion and the ghost, they call us in the city papers. But I don't do it for the headlines. I do it for the quiet satisfaction of a job well done. I spend my weekends at Aunt Irene's, helping her with the roses and listening to her stories. We don't talk much about the golden boy or the family failure anymore. Those characters are dead and buried. I've realized that the most unconventional thing I ever did wasn't becoming a forensic auditor or a corporate fixer. The most unconventional thing I did was choosing myself. I stopped being the shadow and decided to be the light. And you know what? The light is much warmer. So, if you're sitting out there tonight, feeling like the invisible one, the one who's holding up the walls while everyone else gets the credit, just remember, the walls only stay up because you're there. And the moment you decide to walk away and build your own house, the old one is going to come down. Let it. You weren't born to be a foundation for someone else's vanity. You were born to be the architect of your own joy. The fire is dying down now, and the house is quiet. It's a good quiet. A peaceful, honest quiet. And for the first time in my life, I'm not waiting for the phone to ring with someone else's disaster. I'm just waiting for tomorrow, so I can see what I'm going to build next.